So it's 12:04. For some reason, I can see we are not as many as I would have expected. But we'll just begin. Wale ambao watatupata watatupata mahali watatupata. So do I have any housekeeping issues? Not for the moment. I think with that in mind, we can just begin. We begin on a new topic today. Theory of investment. As I've been telling you, we are still on that theme of following up on the components of aggregate demand or national income, as we were given by that man called John Maynard Keynes. So that before we do even other equally important macroeconomic topics, I'm desperate that we go through this channel. So for the last 2 weeks or so, we've been on consumption. Today, I want us now to begin with the I part, what is called investment. So, and what is investment from an economic perspective, especially? And then we'll see factors. And of course, later, I think we shall basically be discussing some theories of investment. We shall also discuss important macroeconomic concepts like multiplier effect, right? Where 1 shilling invested has this tendency of behaving like more than 1 shillings many times over. So when we talk about multiplier effect, what do we mean? When we'll be talking about accelerator effect, what will we be meaning when we shall be talking about it? I believe at the very, very end. It's a topic that I believe we can finish up within these 2 hours. But if not, of course, what remains, we shall tackle it at subsequent classes. If this number does not reach an appreciable number, I shall give a Google form for class attendance. So if you are there and there are people who have decided not to attend, I shall scare you guys with that at some point, because some of these things, as much as we are saying that it is individual, I'll be scared that it is almost 10 past and we are only about 20 in a class of how many? I think you're about 240 something. So I'm a bit worried. So kama itabidi nifike hiyo route, we shall do it. So what is investment? What is the effect of interest rate on investment? Just yesterday, the central bank increased the base lending rate in the economy. How does that affect in investment? What is accelerator theory? And of course, later we shall see what are the factors affecting investment. So of course, we have to begin, as with any other area of human endeavor, by reckoning with the definition. And when you talk about investment, these are things that, and this is actually well, I don't want to call it a tragedy in economics, but I want to call it a challenge in economics, that I'm sure by the time you reach university, you will have heard about most of these terms, up to and including even the term economics, as I argued last semester. But now, how do you now even give it a definition that is germane, or as it is understood within a given discipline, within a given context? If you were to hold a gun to my head and ask me what investment is, I'll just say increase in national stock. Okay, any economic activity that leads to that increase is what will be understood as investment. Increase in a country's stock, right? National stock. And when you talk about investments, of course, in economics, we see it in two ways. There's what we call the public investments. There's what we call the private investments. So what are public investment? What are private investments? Those are things that I'll basically expect at the end for us to have acquainted ourselves with. Okay. So spending additions to capital. By now we know that capital is one of the three factors of production, so far as economics is concerned. So anything that increases the stock of capital is what will be understood to be investments. I believe even as early as last semester, we defined what we mean by capital goods. Goods that are used to produce other goods, goods that one is not able to derive direct utility from. So if you think about a plant, a machinery, an equipment, right? Tractor, right? A farm building, right? We put these investments, or we put this form of capital goods, not so that we are able to derive direct utility from them, but we put them for the primary reason that we'll be able to produce some units of goods, especially goods, but sometimes also services. So spending additions to capital, spending increase in capital stock. So whatever area of human endeavor that actually leads to these additions is what must be understood as investments. In national accounting, we can just define it as a slope of sorts, because it basically be tracking the rate of change in fixed capitals and inventories. Inventories is just stock. You can think about if you have some bags of maize in your granary, if you have some bags of sugar, right? That is basically what is referred to as inventories. Okay, additions to inventories and fixed capital is said to be gross investments as opposed to net investment if it includes asset replacements used in the course of production. Because we know assets by their very nature. And you people, you are commerce people, so there are people there who will be ending up as accounting. You'll be doing about of assets depreciation. Assets inevitably depreciate. And because they depreciate, after a time, there's also the need to replace these assets to that extent of that they have depreciated. So that replacement, if it is included, we talk about gross fixed, the gross additions, right? When the same is deducted from gross investment, what remains is what we call the net investments, right? So that from a national account perspective, and when we talk about national account now, this is deliberately now a macro level or a macroeconomics level concepts, as opposed to a household or an individual that will basically be argued to be microeconomic. And you remember that for the whole of last semester, we restricted ourselves to the same, right? So in national, or when you look at it from a macro level, it is basically the business sector. When you talk about investments, it will basically be restricted to the business sector. And the decisions from an aggregate perspective made by these business sectors to invest, to increase their capital stock. So it must be looked at, even at this early juncture, from a macroeconomic perspective rather than the micro. For that reason, that households, when you talk about households, you're talking about private investments. Because when you talk about households, maybe when you talk about even investments, most households will basically be saying about maybe investment in houses. Okay. Maybe investment in the children's education. Right? This being the greatest, maybe investments made by the household. But when you look at it critically, it will basically at best be seen from a micro perspective rather than a macro perspective. But when you talk about the business sector, now you're aggregating all spheres of economic activities within the economy and basically talking about maybe the capital stock increased by this much or decreased by this much, or arguably did not change for one reason or another. Okay. So at household purchases, when you talk about household purchases, you will basically be restricted to the consumptive side. We will basically be restricted to the consumptive side. It will be consumption. Any purchase by a firm will basically be assumed to be a production endeavor, irrespective of the commodity. We also have this concept, gross domestic fixed deposit, gross domestic fixed capital formation, and will be defined that the way you can see there, spending on fixed assets for the purposes of whether for replacement or for stock addition can be referred to as a gross domestic fixed capital formation. I'll complain until the cows come home. I don't know why Zoom for the last 1 year or so has insisted that when I have to admit people, even when I've given them that permission. They don't know me, I'm a man, I cannot multitask. So when I'm multitasking, it comes at the expense of me giving you people full attention. What are the sources of financing investment? Can talk about internal, can finance them from internal resources, right? Sometimes you save, and from that which you have saved, you can invest when you talk about a business, right? But normally, how many of us are disciplined enough to save to that extent that we can be disciplined enough to save up to the point at which now we can say, you Metosha, you can buy that capital good also. Okay, what is our avenue? You can talk about stock exchange. It's normally a very important source of resource mobilization, especially when you talk about a credit, right? When you talk about even people even investing in your farm or even in your business, that's another avenue. You can talk about also government. And also you can talk about banks. So that from an economic perspective, businesses normally will rely on these four sources majorly in terms of seeking to increase their capital stock at the end of the day. Okay. What influences investment? Part 12. Will we go through the 12? I don't think so. We'll basically just pick a few of these, right? I talked about the government having increased the rate of interest yesterday, what we call the base lending rate. If you go to the central bank site, or if you are subscribed to their channel, you'll basically get a bulletin that they normally issue monthly or once every 2 months. And yesterday, I think they released one. And one of the most dispiriting or the disappointing thing is that they will have decided to increase the rate of interest for the next 2 months by about 0.5. 0.5 might not appear to be very much, but that normally has a knock-on effect on the other rates of interest. And no wonder by today, we are already receiving SMS messages from our respective banks telling us that Nikubaya, maybe you need to check to think about this loan being structured in this way. Okay, so it has a very, very important effect, so that I will not expect ceteris paribus, with at least for the next 2 months, there to be an increase in economic activities, unless there are other factors that might basically prove to be stronger to basically cover for that increase in the rate of interest rates. Otherwise, I would expect, even if at all, the rate of economic activity to either stay the same, because as Kenyans, we are resilient people, but more often than not, you'll find that going down, unfortunately. Rate of change in output is another factor. Okay. How does output change when you talk about even productivity within the economy? When you talk about the level of output and capital, right? So the rate of change of output will basically be the rate of change in this output level, the rate of change in capital, basically influencing decisions on how to invest. And we shall see this, especially when we shall be talking about the accelerator theory, how this works, right? We are in businesses to make profits, right? And whenever you are in a sector, whenever you're in a business, an industry, and you realize that they are not making profits, from a rational perspective, one will expect you to do what? To pull off, right? In terms of investing less or even not investing. But the more you make profits, the more you'll always be interested or to be motivated to invest in that particular sector, in that particular industry, in that particular firm. Size of the public sector, I think I was sharing with the other class yesterday that right now, when you read most economic forecasts, they're talking about countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia becoming very, very big economies as early as 2050. And even me, from an economic point of view, when I look at it, I was initially asking myself how. Because we know Nigeria with its problems, there is a war or some conflict, not really a war, but a conflict between the North and South that normally will be expected to affect economic activities. In Ethiopia has been in a war of sorts for the last 2 or 3 years. And even before that, they have had some periodic conflicts. But if you think about these two countries being the two biggest economies, not really economies, but two biggest in terms of population, then it starts making sense when you talk about the size of the public sector influencing investment, because this big population will always be acting as a magnet to even investors, and especially even the foreign investors. And I believe part of the reason as to why even Safaricom chose to invest in Ethiopia will be due to that, because you find about Ethiopia is already twice our population. I think they normally talk about 110. I don't know whether they have conducted census or not, but that number is normally bandied around as part of the population, as we are about 53, 55 million. So it always proved to be some sort of a magnet to such an economy, to an extent that actually when as a business person, as an entrepreneur, you'll normally see that in terms of even the possible or the potential business opportunities that might arise out of such an economy, that only acting as an enticement to invest. So it might be that those forecasters who have made this prediction that this will actually will become, while some of the major economies, not only in Africa, but the world, will have seen it in terms of that. Because if you're having a population of 110, of course, comparatively, also the size of the public sector will be reasonably big. If the public sector is big and if they are paying some competitive salaries, of course, now you have to think about that in terms of being a possible market for goods or services. And if you think about it critically, Safaricom investments begins to make quite a lot of sense. Only that we'll hope that actually those assumptions are right and they'll be proven in due course. Businesses hate uncertainty. In fact, kama kuna kitu businesses or even the economic sector, for lack of a better word, if there's something they hate is uncertainty. And what is uncertainty? Uncertainty, if we were to describe it in two words, is just to describe it as unmeasured risk. Right? You normally hear the word risks and uncertainty being used interchangeably. They are not the same. Risk is measured. When you think about risk is empirical or measurable. Right? It's a measurable probability of an event happening or not happening. And because you can measure it, what can be measured can be planned for in terms of minimizing the risk or the opportunity of a bad event happening or maximizing the probability of a good event happening. Right? But when it's uncertain, you will actually appreciate that this will act as a discouragement or as a disincentive of some sort for investment. Businesses normally want to invest, wakati una invest, you want where you invest your shilling, that shilling to bear another shilling, if not other shillings. Okay? And whenever there are uncertainties, you normally find serious investment vehicles or serious investment shying off from such or investing in such economies where these uncertainties abound. So when you talk about even war situations, when we talk about even in terms of our Kenyan situation, if you ask me what normally lets us down is actually these public policies, right? Sometimes we are at a point whereby maybe because of our democracy, an investment opportunity might actually end up bypassing us simply because these elections we are holding every 5 years, and sometimes somebody coming in and coming up with public policies that might not be favorable to a certain investment opportunity, actually serious investors choosing to shy off altogether. So public policies also influence investment in that way. Businesses, by their very nature, they are conservative. By their very nature, they are actually conservative rather than being progressive. Ile kitu ambayo wanataka, once they come to an economy, they want somewhere whereby they can recoup their investments in as few months, in as few years as possible, and maybe even reinvest or maybe get out of such economies after maybe these investments have been recouped. So when you think about even public policies, they must be put in such a way as to entice these investment opportunities. And that's why I was talking about, when you even think about even the rate of interest being what it is, acting as a disincentive, right? As kind of a discouragement from even people coming in to invest in such economies, in such business areas. And sometimes this current government, sometimes they scare us from an economic point of view, because sometimes we hear somebody coming up with a proposal and we are like, what are they eating? Right? And it's in that spirit that actually, when you think about even the levies that they have introduced, if you think about even the taxes that they have introduced, if you think about even now, there is all this hullabaloo if you go to the social media space about even the e-citizen as a form of payment, right? And there are policies, right? And I'm not really interested in their wrongness or otherwise, but sometimes from a investment point of view, you wonder how or to what extent they might act as a disincentive from people to invest. You saw pay bills have been around like for years and years, but from some time last year, for the first time, you saw actually businesses shying away from this as a avenue of payment for goods and services. Okay. So public policies matter. The right public policies will affect investment positively. The wrong ones will also affect the same negatively. When you think about inadequate financial system and technology, maybe I might want to tackle them in tandem, right? Kenya, we have been a bit more advanced in Africa comparatively. We have even been innovators, right? When you think about even M-Pesa, when M-Pesa was started, that was the year 2007, and I was very, very happy when it began, because I was like, wow, what a nice convenience. So the same year, I went for 4 months outside the country to South Africa. And, you know, maybe it was because I had really expected much from South Africa, because in our minds those days, South Africa was this economy that was very developed. So I was like, of course, if M-Pesa is in Kenya, it must be in South Africa in a big, big, big way. So even when I was going, I think I was assuring my family that there will be no worries. I will go there, we'll make money. I shall be sending you money, so don't worry. So imagine my shock when I went, and I think after settling for a week, you've already bought a SIM card, you've done everything. Then I was like, I need to send some money back to Kenya. So imagine my shock when there wasn't this M-Pesa equivalent, and we had to opt for very, very expensive vehicles like Western Union and MoneyGram. To an extent that I even told my family back home, I just told them, no, you guys, even if you have to borrow, borrow. Because at that point, actually, it was arguably even easier for them to borrow and then me to come back and just pay with the money that I would have made within those 4 months, rather than having them sending them money. Because actually, I think they were charging as much as 13% of what you've sent. So imagine you want to send 1,000 and they take 130. So 10,000, that's 1,300. 100,000, that was the whole 13,000 just for sending. By the time ikifika huku inafika kama 87,000. So I believe that time in Kenya, we were streets ahead. And you might imagine that because we are advanced, sometimes in Kenya, it is very, very easy for us to assume that these services are everywhere. I think I was watching TikTok and there was somebody who was been traveling throughout Africa for the last 10 weeks or so. And even when she came in Kenya, she remarked at how convenient some of these financial systems that we have in place as M-Pesa. When you go to bank, we are internationally connected as Kenya. And she found our stay here very, very Very, very convenient from a money point of view. So investment in these technologies, investments into these financial systems. When somebody comes out from outside the country and finds these financial systems in place with their conveniences, with their ability to even influence economic activities, people arguably will be enticed to basically come back and invest in our economy, right? Population trends ties in with what I spoke of when I was talking about size of the sector. But when you talk about population trends, it's about even population and the expected population in future time, T+1, right? Because now we find actually the reality is that actually most of these developed countries, their populations are declining. I was listening to South Korea. I think their not really expectancy, but the amount of babies that are being born per woman, I think every woman is being expected to have something like 0.6 babies throughout her lifetime, as against the recommended replacement level, whereby a woman should actually is expected to bear about 2.1 kids during her life. So this is a population whereby now you replace the man and the woman in the economy. So at 2.1, the population will remain the same, right? But when you think about South Korea, right now they are prosperous, but they are rightly worried because, which means that in 5, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you will have a population which is top heavy. You will have a population made up of old people, with the youth being a very, very small number at the bottom, right? And yet, when you think about population, the productive part of the population normally is a young, that tends to be young rather than old. So even with their prosperity, you find that most countries, a good number of countries, not really most, but a good number of countries, I know South Korea has this problem, Italy, US, I don't think so, because US normally has this blessing that they are able to entice people to come to the economy. Right now, they're even having a problem with Mexicans through immigration, and they are able to even give you citizenship and all that. But a good number of countries in Europe also, they have this problem of declining population. I know Japan, for a fact, has this big problem. So they are rightly worried because they are seeing that there's no future. As much as now they are prosperous, they are actually rightly worried that in terms of their population, they might decline. And even from an investment point of view, because we're talking about investment, it's a case whereby now you'll find even people being discouraged by this declining population from really committing optimal investment amounts to these economies. Expected lifetime income is another one. Companies look at this because when they look at your income, they want to know how much can they enjoy out of your income, and that will always inform their investment decisions. The reason as to why we don't have high-end companies in Kenya is this: our incomes are low. Kuna watu wanatuangalia hivi wanasema hapa hata tukiweka company tutakuwa tunatupa mbao because there simply be no market for our goods and services, right? Lastly, availability and cost of mortgage finance. This actually works, especially now when we talk about even investment in capital projects from a micro level. When we talk about households investing in houses. Why houses? Houses are perhaps the single most expensive expenditure item for most households. So you want somewhere whereby these costs are low rather than somewhere which are high, because when they're low, more people are able to come in to take these loans for mortgages and all that. And that's why we can now even go back to our first point and say the decision to increase the interest rates yesterday having or proving to be a disincentive or a discouragement of sorts to us as Kenya in terms of people seeking to take these loans for these purposes. So maybe even if I wanted to take a mortgage, I'll be like, wacha ningoje kwanza irudi chini. And I know even this was a problem, especially for last year for these two countries, the UK and Canada. I have a friend actually who bought a house last year and she was really, really, really complaining about the initial financing costs. And I thought this is just a result of most of these economies coming out of COVID, trying to reboot, and as a result, pushing their interest rates high in order to take care of things like inflation and all that. Right. So even right now, worldwide, you find this cost being really effectively quite high for that reason. And one will expect that maybe less and less people investing in houses as a result. I can see something in Q&A. Anonymous participant, inadequate financial system attracts more investors. No, it cannot attract more investors because when you are inadequate, that's another element of uncertainty, right? That's another element of uncertainty that is being introduced into the matrix of investment. So if I have two countries, anonymous participant, if I call these two countries country A and country B, if here there is adequacy in these systems, and B has inadequate, right? If in the other matrix, they are the same, you will not be rational. You have a right to invest in even in B, but we'll call you anything, but will not call you rational. You want to invest whereby there are adequate financial system. Why Nairobi is actually developed, even with these problems that we have, is because of this. You go to Uganda, you'll wonder. In terms of the options that you have, even in terms of banking. Kenya is one of the most banked countries, I think, in Africa. Even in the world, we are quite competitive. With our, is it 43 banks? I think at the last count, there are about 43 banks. You go to even our neighbors and you find even in Ethiopia, they're talking about less than 10. For a population which is double our population. Okay. I think they're less than 10. Right now is when now M-Pesa is trying to penetrate, but they're having a lot of problems. They're not having the welcome that they had in Kenya. Yeah, because they are not used to it. M-Pesa, you know, is a uniquely Kenyan thing. And you go to even other countries, even in Europe, maybe because they are used to other convenient ways of getting money, they have not embraced M-Pesa. But nowadays they are embracing them because of especially the proliferation of smartphones. I hear them talking about things like Flutterwave. I think they even things like PayPal, I think to some extent. There are those apps that they have. And once you do app and you find it's convenient, you'll be like, yeah, this is the way I shall be working going forward. Nowadays, I can be speaking to people even in Canada, in the US. I think in the last 1 year, I think I've had money sent to me while I'm literally speaking to people in the phone 3 or 4 times. Okay, so that speaks to these conveniences that we are having. But there are countries without them. So if I'm an investor, and if you are rational, you invest in A, you'll not invest in B. I want to know your view on that, but that is actually my strong opinion on the same. You cannot be said, you will want somewhere where there is adequacy in financial systems, right? Because the finances, you want to transfer financial resources from point A to point B fast and with least costs possible, right? So if they are not there, or if they are there, they're inadequate, that ceteris paribus will act not as an incentive, but will act as a disincentive. I want to know your view, anonymous participant, on the same. But if you ask me, that is my view on the same. So as I said, I think I'll just pick. I don't think I'll pick up on many. I just think I'll just pick about a few of them, and then we shall see. Not the 12, but this about, I think about 6 or so important ones. Of course, beginning with interest rate. As I said, you want interest rate to be low as possible in order to encourage investments, because interest rates are costs of capital, and they're actually costs of investments. Why you find even our loans, even for our public investments being unreasonable, is that our politicians are sometimes incentivized to go for loans that are not cheap, loans that are inexpensive. Na wakati inafikia ya kuilipa, tunapata hii shida ambayo saizi tuko nayo na Eurobond. Right now, because now imefika wakati wa kuilipa, na unaona ya kuwa serikali yetu inatapatapa kwa kiasi kikubwa, because I think this year they should be paying some good amount of it. I don't know whether I heard about 300 billion. All right, a loan that was taken about 10 years ago, I think was it 200 billion shillings, give or take. I forget. Okay. So because now we are paying the principal amount this year in a shida, and part of it, and they were advised even when they were taking it that interest rate iko juu sana. So unakuta ya kuwa the value for these loans maybe, na hata watu wanashindwa ilitumika wapi. So these are the problems that we are asking. So whenever you are, a good investment will be the one whose returns exceed the costs, not exceed than the costs. You'll allow me to make that right. So we normally use what is called the present value to calculate what a good investment is, what a good and not a good investment is. And there's something called cost benefit analysis of this project. Right. So when you are putting up an expressway, what rationale do we use that we say, maybe rather than having a road, let's have an expressway. Rather than having a bypass, let's have an expressway. Rather than having a hospital, let's have a road, for example. Normally, we use what is called present value, and it is defined as current discounted value of future returns of a given investment. And when you talk about the cost versus benefit, of course, you'll only be rational if you take that decision whereby the benefit exceeds the costs of a project. So we'll do a simple example whereby we have an investment which at the beginning of the year is saying to cost about $900. And we are talking about a future return at the end of the year of 1,100 at an interest rate of 10% per annum. right? So this can only make sense that if we invest this 900, the present value of having or engaging in a project will be more than this 900. How do we calculate the present value? We use this formula here. Future returns, right? Over one time plus, sorry, the rate of interest. Okay. Now future return here is 1,100. Okay. Of course, the present the investment is 900, right? So when we calculate it, the present value will yield a value of, because it will be 1,100 divided by 1 plus 0.1. 0.1, of course, is from what? 10%. 10% is 10 over 100. 10 over 100 is what? 0.1. We have just converted that percentage into a decimal, right? So if it's calculated, somebody can confirm that that will give us a present value of 1,000, because it will be 1,100 divided by 1.1. 1.1 will cancel to give us a value of, or that will be 10. So 10, 0, should be giving us 1,000. So it is this 1,000, the present value of future investment, that will be compared as per the cost of investment. And if it is more, right, as you can see, the present value is seen as greater than the present cost of the investment. So if you do it and you get a value that is more than 900, there is a rationale of engaging in that investment, because it will basically be a case whereby we'll talk about the benefits of that investment, which is what? 1,000 exceeding the costs, which is $900. Okay. So just a simple way of making a decision of whether to engage in a certain project or not, or whether the money that you have, in our case here, it's 900, whether it shall bear some returns in the future. Now, of course, here our future is just limited to 1 year, because now we're talking about the beginning of the year and the end of the year, right? Whereby the beginning of the year is 900 and the end of the year is 1,100. But many projects are multi-year. Okay. So actually the correct formula for present value is basically future returns 1 plus I raised to n, whereby n is the number of years expected for the project. The other ones remaining future return, bado inabaki as FR, I being the rate of interest. So in the second example here, we shall be doing, let me just read it. In the case of an investment whose returns cover a time period more than 1 year, the present value will be the total of the discounted values of all future returns. So the same example, but now we are talking about not 1 year, but we are talking about 2 years, so that our n here is not 1 as before, but n is equals to 2. So actually the formula will be, as you can see here, right? Future returns 1, future returns 2, right? One can think about if it's the third year, there will be FR3, 1 plus I, 3. If it's the fourth year, future returns for the fourth year, I for up to the nth future return, 1 plus I n, right? At the end of the day. But let me not really confuse you too much. I think there's a place by the time you graduate, lazima mtafanya something called cost benefit analysis and shall be meeting with this animal. For now, let me just restrict it into this simple, whereby we have a 2-year project. So we shall just use that. You remember that one was for the first year. Now for the second year, we have been given the future return as $10. So we shall just use that formula the way it is. The previous future return, 1100 over 1 plus 0.1. Of course, this one is brackets raised to power 1, so that we're just leaving it as 1 plus 0.1 plus the future return for the second year, 1210, as you can see here. Hii tu ndio imekuja hapo. Then 1 plus 0.1 into brackets squared. Okay. And if you do that, of course, I think that should give you 2,000. So the present value of that investment in the second year will have grown from 900 to 2,000. So do you go ahead with that project? Of course, you go ahead with that project because you can see you are making returns already. If you can make more than 1,000 out of an investment within 2 years, then there is a rationale for you continuing with that project. Right? So that's a way in which now interest rates can be used to make a decision of whether you continue with the business. Unaweza sema ya kuwa no, I'm better off investing my money in other business ventures. I'm better off investing my money in other economies at the end of the day. As you said, profitability or rate of what? Rate of return. Yeah, rate of return. Profitability, as we said, higher profits, higher incentives to continue with the business, because profits will always raise or increase your future expectations about the performance of a business, about the possible returns to capital at the end of the day. Okay. So the higher they are, the better. Safaricom was a no company that not very many people knew only about 23 years ago. Right now, we're talking about it being the highest performing company for many years, not only in East Africa, but we're talking about East Central Africa, and maybe even a good part of the Southern African region in terms of the returns to capital or the returns to investments for such a company. So you can see even it has acted as an incentive year on year, the amount of investment that they have been doing in terms of putting up base stations, in terms of putting up offices, in terms of strengthening their customer service and all that. Okay. Whereas if I compare them now with Telkom and if they are competitors, right, you can see even now, I'm not even reasonably confident of using my Telkom SIM to even teach. Today I had to buy some bundles for my fiber because it's a point whereby I'm not reasonably confident that that bundle can take me comfortably in a 2-hour class, right? And yet when you look at Telkom is a parent of Safaricom. So holding all other factors constant, well, we even have expected Telkom to be performing better, right? But because of reasons, especially simply because they are state-owned, right? Enterprise. And this coming maybe the possible lack of investments. So they cannot perform to the level of their son or daughter called Safaricom. Because me personally, if I have Safaricom, I even forget. Nowadays, they don't, their services have dropped somewhat. But for many, many years, we never used to doubt the service as given by Safaricom at the end of the day, right? And you can see when people really wanting to invest in Safaricom, some people even wanting to hijack it. Every government, people always ask themselves, how can they get the piece of the pie, partly because of the profits and the high profits that they've been making over time. Size of public sector. Right? Public sector size is good, but public sector always has this negative effect on investment. What we call the crowding out effect. And what do we mean by crowding out effect? Crowding out effect simply means that because creditors will normally prefer to lend to government or the public sector rather the private sector. What happens is that you'll always find that there is some crowding out of credit, especially, that normally will happen to the disadvantage of the private sector. There's that aspect of crowding out effect. Here, now we are talking about if the public sector decides that they'll be the main producers of goods and services. And that's why we don't encourage government to enter the market in terms of saying now that they will be the ones that now produce these goods and services. From economics, actually, we are looking at this and actually having this as being part of the reason why this affordable housing may not work. Because the government is a poor market participant. The government is in the business of providing public services. The government is in the business of providing regulatory frameworks. But now when they decide now to enter a certain market and say, we are also players in this market, just as other firms in this market, you find firms in those kind of markets, especially the housing market in Kenya, they are reasonably apprehensive because they are like, now, the government with its billions, right? And the way they are able to mobilize resources, it will be a case of whereby the cake that we shall be getting, if at all, will be small, will be smaller than expected. And even maybe some investors who might have wanted even to go into this sector might shy off out of entering in that sector at the end of the day. Okay. So that crowding out simply happens in the case of the government coming in and muscling these participants, private participants, out of the market through demand, reduction in demand for their services. Right? A government is able to marshal a lot of resources. If done well, they're able to even sell these houses cheaper. In Kenya, we do things the opposite. So somebody has actually even argued that maybe these houses will end up even being more expensive than those ones which are being put up by for private market participants. I have a friend called Dandy, the MD of Saito, and every time he always express his apprehension because he's also in this sector. They are building houses, not really affordable, but they are building houses. So there is always expressing his apprehension that at the end of the day, there is a risk that this the affordable housing might just end up distorting the market without really providing the solution as envisaged. In any case, who will actually end up affording this housing? I've always been arguing that even the ones that Raila started in Langata in the 90s, I think it's Madare 4A. Kenyans, we are still a low-income country. And when you tell even somebody even just to mobilize 500,000 to buy a house, it's not a lot of money. But how many people are able to afford that? It becomes a big, big issue. So even this crowding out effect is a negative in the economy. Even when you think about the provision of credit, creditors will always want to lend to the government rather than the private sector. We are too risky. I'm too risky as an individual, but when they lend the government, even at lower interest rates, they don't sleep wondering whether the government will pay them or not. They know the government, unless there is a war situation, governments normally will be in the habit of paying for the loans that they have taken. Okay. So that's basically what we are talking about here. And basically, I don't want to get into the details of this equation, but it basically is showing that because when you can talk about investment by the public, consumption by the public, and private investment by public and public. So for private and public. So a large increase in investment by the public sector normally ends up crowding out investment by the private sector. So they'll basically be a case of whereby they'll not be able to get adequate avenues to invest their capital. I talked about uncertainty. I think this is self-explanatory, right? And you can see, I think anonymous participant, you can actually see that in periods of uncertainty, people actually can even get out of these capital projects whenever there's uncertainty. And that's why you don't want war. Kwa zingine nasikianga Wakenya wakisema tuende vita. We have not really experienced a war situation, but even without doing that, I will not really wish for that to really happen, because these are something that actually introduce a very, very big element of uncertainty. And even if there was an investor who wanted to come to invest, they'll actually say, no, let's wait. Or let's even not invest at all. Let's go to another investment destination. So the effect of uncertainty is that the value of future returns of business projects will fall as a result. Okay, public policies, as I said. You don't want to raise taxes. Government, from a free market perspective, a lot of government used to act as to put some regulatory mechanism and provide public utilities, right? When you talk about electricity, when you talk about data, when you talk about water and such things, if it must. In some more developed economies, actually, even government shy away out of these sectors and they say, wacha ibakie private sector. Sisi wacha to provide some regulation, let's collect taxes and maybe provide some of these essential services like defense and policing, putting law and order. Okay. So in Kenya right now, and what is happening in Kenya, and it's good that I'm teaching this when these things are happening in real time. Holding all other factors constant, if you remove politics out of it, Kenyans will like a bit of politics. This can only act as the same way that we described here. It's just crowding out the public sector. And even if there was somebody who would have been enticed to come in to invest, they'll actually want to play the wait and see game, unfortunately, to the detriment of our economy, because they'll be like, we are not sure what is happening here in Kenya. And why do we have to have so many regulations? Why do we have to have so many laws? Why do we have to have so many of this and that? So maybe we'd rather go to Uganda. We'd rather go to Tanzania. We'd rather go to South Africa. We'd rather even skip Africa. Kama hiyo ndio kitu ambao Afrika wanafanya. Let's go to another investment destination. Okay. So that works especially in terms of taxes. The subsidy provision normally has a very, very big impact in terms of enticing new investments, in terms of affecting especially private investments at the end of the day. Do I need to explain anything of the efficiency of the financial system? The more efficient, the better. That's why I think I argued it to be self-explanatory. Right? Technology, we had talked about it, right? When you think about innovations, even comparing where we were even 20 years ago and now with conveniences such as M-Pesa. Conveniences, I don't know the last time I went to my bank. It must have been mid last year. Because everything now you can do outside the bank. In fact, this brick and mortar model of banking, whereby a bank has to be housed in a certain locality, in some contexts and in some areas of the world is disappearing because of the adequacy of technology. Because what it has done is that you are able to provide the same service, same good, more efficiently at less cost, right? So innovations always, to the extent that it expands the frontier, will always have a better effect on investments. And actually, if I can invest 1 shilling and get 20 bob, why not? And that's basically what this technology enables us to do. That's why even the richest people in the world, arguably, are people who actually saw something and invested in some technology, the Bezos, the Musks of this world. I can see something in chat before I go to the theory. Examples of those uncertainties, Cabra, I'll throw that back to you. You know, there are some things that I expect you people to be curious enough to say, let me note this and let me go and investigate further. But if you think about even war, who knew that people in Israel will be warring right now? 1 year ago. 1 year ago, we were concentrating on Ukraine. And then October 7th, people went, killed about 200 people in somewhere in Israel. And Israel has decided it's an all-out war. Okay? So imagine we wanted to invest. I think I have a friend who, I don't know whether he ended up going to Israel, but he was to go to Israel last year. No, actually not last year, but this January. So last month. I've not been friendly enough to call him, but when we met with him at the end of last year, I think he had those plans. That was even before that war broke out, because I think I saw him lastly in September. So those are the plans he had. Right. So is he still there, or maybe he thought it was too risky and decided not to go at the end of the day? Right. So those are the questions. Those are the uncertainties that we think about in life. Life is uncertain. And that's why I said that you want to have risks, because risks you can measure. When you talk about probability, and I think I said 0.2, those who know betting, they know these things. When you talk about odds, odds is just the probability of an event occurring or not occurring at the end of the day. So you can measure and you decide, I'll take the risk or not. But when you talk about uncertainties by their very, very nature are unmeasurable. You cannot measure uncertainty. And because you cannot measure, that window of you making that decision of whether to engage in that investment, for example, or not, becomes that much difficult for you to make from a rational perspective, right? So when you think about uncertainties, think in that way. At the end of the day, Scarborough, I think that was the only comment that I've seen, right? Was when you think about earthquakes, nobody announces an earthquake. They just occur. Nobody announces a bad weather event. Because about hata saizi tunasema weather forecasting, but even right now, even the most powerful tools, I think we are limited. Nobody can tell you 1 year from now whether there'll be a bad weather in a certain locality with any level of confidence. So sometimes it's just better for you to just say, it's too uncertain, I'll not invest. Because I'm not able to calculate the risks involved. I better invest in somewhere I am reasonably confident about. Accelerator theory. Let me just open Anini because they seem as if there's something that yeah. So what is this theory all about? The major thing is that we are talking about investment not really being influenced by the output level, but it will be influenced by the rate of change in output. Okay? The rate of change in output. And that's basically what explains this accelerator. That we are not talking about really the output level as it is, or the level of output, but we are talking about it being introduced by the extent to which output is changing, the rate at which output is changing, right? So at current net investment, and I shall just quickly shed these points. Just realize that slide was missing. Current net investment is a function of past incomes. Current net investment is said to be dependent on changes in past incomes. I think okay. Yeah, those are the 2 points I wish to pick. I think that slide is missing in the presentation. So that if the demand for a product remains constant, there's no need for increasing production or the capital stock. What is expected is just to ensure that replacement investment, and this replacement investment is as a result of depreciation. Whenever you're investing, there is need for us to take care of depreciation. You just replace investment only to that extent that to cover for the depreciation of machinery or the depreciation of assets, if you like. So that's what accelerator theory demands, that actually it's basically dependent on the rate of change in output rather than the level of output. Okay. So that the only rationale for additional investment is only to the extent that there is an increase in demand. So increase in demand is what engenders new investments in capital stock. And the maintenance of constant positive investment requires demand of the product to increase at a steady rate. Okay. So as an example, basically what we are talking about in terms of this is the level of outputs, right? Changing in millions of shillings. This is the rate of change in output. Here we are talking about the consumption expenditure. We are just talking about consumption being equivalent to the output, right? So that if you see an increase in these 5 years, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5, and if you're talking about the year, output level having changed from 100 million to 110 million, 110 million to 150 million, 150 million to 200 million, and then it decreases to 180. If subsequently we are able to track the rate of change in this output or consumption expenditure, for example, as 10%, and you can do this empirically, 36.36%, 33.33%, and lastly, negative 10%. We are saying that a rational investor will not be concerned with this column of the output level. A rational investor will only be concerned with the rate of change of that column. So the most important column for an investor will be the rate of change in, well, they call it consumption, or they call it output, but let's just consider it as output for now, for the sake of argument. So that you shall see this, and this one actually has an increase in investments, 20, 60, 50, and 0, tracking the rate of change in output rather than the output level. Why? In year 1, he gets an expenditure of 100 million, decides to invest 20 million. As a result of that jump from 100 to 110. When the rate of change increases from 10% to 36%, a threefold, more than threefold increase, you can see what is happening. And these are just hypothetical values, by the way. He triples his investment from 20 million to 60 million. When the rate of change slightly falls from 36 to 33, and you can see how sensitive he is, it has fallen, it has increased anyway. When you talk about the output level in essence has increased quite significantly from 150 to 200. But because the rate of change has gone down slightly from 36 to 33, the investor being rational decides to say, okay, as much as I shall increase not really increase, but I shall still invest, but let me reduce my exposure. And then from year 4 to year 5, you'll see that for the first time, the output level decreases from 200 million to 180 million. He sees that as he or she sees that as a red flag and decides not to invest, because that's what zero implies. So investment between year 4 and year 5 becomes zero because of that shock that the investor is so sensitive to changes in output or the rate of change in output that a minus or a negative leads him to a decision to not invest for that year. And that's what accelerator theory is all about, that actually the investor will track not the output level of the farm, but the rate of change of output for the said farm. So the relevant column, as I said, just by way of repeating, is less this, but it's the column that is tracking the rate of change in the economy. And when you look at this critically, as much as these are hypothetical values, don't try to see whether ziko na relation hapa hazina. They're hypothetical, but them being hypothetical, they are basically telling that story that the investor is so sensitive to changes in the rate of change for the good or service that any change to the negative, he responds to it in a slightly negative way. And any positive change in the rate of change, he basically anacheza kama yeye, and he decides to put his money where his mouth is and invest more at the end of the day. Okay. A similar theory, let's not even go to this accelerator theory, the mathematics, but when you talk about the mathematics, if you think about the formula, I don't think I'll test you for this anywhere. I shall be posting this slide at the end. At a higher level, if you will do more economics, you will be given that mathematics to basically capture the accelerator theory. A slightly related concept with the accelerator effect is what we call multiply effect. And in multiply effect, I cannot really overemphasize its importance in economics, and especially when you talk about even investment decisions, simply because multiply effects basically simply seems to suggest that a shilling invested normally will have a larger than proportionate effect on the aggregate demand in a given economy. So any injection in public investment into a given economy is observed to result in a more than proportional effect on aggregate demand or national income. You'll always hear people talk about government multiplier, investment multiplier, and such like multipliers. This is basically what we mean, that any shilling invested will always have this tendency of behaving like 2 shillings, 3 shillings, 4 shillings, where now it impacts on the country's or an economy's aggregate demand or the national income. This is basically from actually our equation, right? When you talk about that C plus I plus C plus x minus m. So when you do about change in y over change in I, for example, right? We're talking about that multiplier in terms of investment, that any shilling that is due to increase in public investment having a larger than proportionate effect on the dependent variable. In our case here, it might also be either the aggregate demand or the national income. And I believe I have an example here. Graphically, it can be shown in this way. And the key points here is that when we track aggregate demand on the y-axis and the national income or the national output, but let's use the national income on the x-axis. This is basically what we mean, that when we talk about the aggregate demand being, we took it over the international sector, C plus I plus G, the effect of government investment, this, because that is what is missing from down here, right? Because when you look at this curve here, the aggregate demand line only having consumption and investment. But now when you add the role of the government as an investor up here, causing this increase in aggregate demand, but you'll see it being a smaller increase compared to what occurs when now you consider the national or increase in national income. It will be a bigger change, even just visually, just by visualizing it, it will be a bigger change. And that's basically what we are talking about as the multiply effect, a shilling invested, because government is a public investor, normally will impact on national income more than proportionately. Okay. Right? And that can be shown also mathematically. And mathematically, we use this marginal propensity to consume, that concept that we had gotten in the theory of consumption. And that's how basically when we can even talk about even the investment multiplier basically being expressed as 1/1 minus C, the way I have expressed it here. So that if you have an individual income increasing by maybe say 100 shillings, and who decides out of these 100 shillings to dedicate 80 shillings to consumption and to save 20 shillings, right? When we think about even the effect on the investment, we'll talk about a shilling, this shilling investment increasing aggregate demand by upwards of 5 times that 1 shilling. So the investment multiplier there, for example, because he's saving, that will be the MPC, because he's consuming out of the 100 shillings, 80 bob, 80 over 100 should give you something like 0.8. Let's ignore this for 1. But now this one will be the marginal propensity to consume. And if we replace it here, that will be 1 divided by 0.2. And that is what is giving us that 5. But bottom line is simply the fact that 1 shilling, and we have a lot of multipliers in the economy, 1 shilling on the right-hand side, whether we talk about even and I rarely hear about consumption, but we normally hear especially investment multiplier and the government multiplier, normally has a larger effect on the aggregate demand or the national income as a result. And that's basically what we refer to as the multiplier effect. Okay. And multiplier and accelerator effect are related in this way. Almost they work simultaneously, right? When you talk about multipliers, it's a case of where consumption leads to investments. When on the other hand, we talk about accelerators or the accelerator effect, it's the opposite of that. The investment leading to consumption. So they are opposite to one another, but they work in tandem. So they are basically two concepts that must not be seen as being foreign to one another. Any question? I can see I still have the question by the anonymous participant. Any question? So in the absence of a question, it's 13:36. I've been teaching since 9 today. So you'll allow me to call it a day there. Let's meet next week when we shall now. We are just still going to that theme that I had said. Lazima tumalizane na hizi leo tumemaliza investment. Last week we did consumption. Next week now we shall be doing now the government. And then we shall do import, export. I think in unison. And then now we shall now go to other macroeconomic concepts like inflation, unemployment, national income accounting, money and banking at the end of the day. At the same time, start thinking about a cut soon, or an assignment, whether you want an assignment, whether you want a cut. Let's have that discussion maybe next week. Normally, more or less how we did it with the Con 111. I'll just prepare, in the case of a cut, a Google form. And once we have agreed on the times, you will be able to sit for the same. And this time, maybe we shall be having arguably more than one or two. I think I prefer that more than, rather than the assignments that we used to have, as those assignments are so difficult sometimes to mark. So maybe I'd much rather have it going the cut way, but shall discuss on the same. So maybe the next 2 weeks or in the next week, we can have a cut. So you guys have a good day. We meet next week.